a creature once walked among us. He was tall with long hair wrapped into a bun, a beard perfectly manicured to give that rugged yet refined look. He frequented craft breweries, secondhand bookstores, and wrote poetry in the park. He listened to the Smiths and Bon Iver and drank coffee from places he'd never visited. But one day, he disappeared. Perhaps he grew up, started a family, set all of those whims of late adolescence aside for a more monotonous existence in the suburbs. Or maybe we all became a little more like him. The hipster.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time. A long time.
About 15 years ago, they were crawling through artsy neighborhoods in every major and mid-sized city in America. They were idealistic, fashionable, and occasionally pretentious. And they were trendsetters. The avalanche of media and think pieces they left in their wake should not go unrecognized. Everyone detested their smug nonconformity, yet emulated their style. But somewhere in the haze before COVID sent baristas, artisan cheese specialists, and performance artists indoors, the hipster disappeared. In this video, I'm here to make the case once and for all that hipsters might have been the good guys all along, and maybe our collective enemy, the corporate millennial social justice writer, is what sent them into hiding. I am here today to single-handedly resurrect the hipster. Hey guys, welcome back to Undoctrination. My name is Maggie, and I'm feeling a little nostalgic. Hipsters were at their peak during my early tween years, a time when listening to Neutral Milk Hotel in the dark was like a salve to my young, tortured soul. And I must admit, I wanted to be a hipster. I thought the girls in vintage dresses with record collections of the best indie folk albums were iconic, frankly. But as I became a teenager, I quickly realized that the term hipster was a pejorative, used to mock these cringy creatives. Now here I am, in my mid-20s. Unlike the traditional hipster, I did not show up to the party early before it was cool. I showed up a decade late. The neighborhood's been gentrified, a waspy couple opens the door, and is confused why I showed up for a stick and poke event in 2025. I thought it might be fun to give in to a little nostalgia and dig really deep into the legacy hipsters left behind and the underlying political turmoil that led to their untimely demise. While some scholars date the roots of the hipster subculture all the way back to the 1940s and 50s with jazz culture, the beginning of the alternative scene we think of today was in the 90s. Hipsters found influence from bohemians and the Romanticism movement of the 19th century. Sensitive, young, lower-middle-class Americans were drawn to the introspective, anti-corporatist, progressive-ish movement that promoted authentic culture and individuality. Mark Grief, a genuine hipster expert, said these hipsters were a white avant-garde that wanted to disaffiliate itself from whiteness, with its stain of Eisenhower, the bomb, and the corporation, and achieve the cool knowledge and exoticized energy, lust, and violence of Black Americans. It's a bit harsh, Mark, but maybe you have a point. I wouldn't know. I was a baby. Hipsters grew a reputation throughout the 2000s for being environmentally conscious and anti-status quo. But they also grew wealthier as more middle and upper class kids joined their ranks, dissatisfied with their parents' generation's cavalier attitudes towards the world. They were artistically minded and craved authenticity, so they moved to artsier neighborhoods in major cities and brought lots of disposable income with them. Corporations took notice of this rising subculture with new demands for products, such as environmentally friendly production processes, ethically sourced labor and materials, and vintage or eco aesthetics. One criticism often lobbed at the hipster is the hypocrisy of being anti-capitalist while inspiring excessive consumerism. Much of the lumberjack, rough man aesthetic market is a byproduct of hipster culture. Same with outdoorsy brands like Patagonia. And who can forget the indie industry with movies, music, secondhand clothing stores, fast fashion inspired by vintage aesthetics, the revival of old school technologies like vinyl and Polaroid cameras, as well as the revival of gonzo journalism through the creation of Vice magazine, which documented the rise of the hipster subculture through the lens of hipsters themselves. This influence in the market was very melodramatically proclaimed as some grave injustice hipsters had committed against their own ideas. Dale Buren said, "The hipster is that person who in fact aligns himself both with rebel subculture and with the dominant class, and thus opens up a poisonous conduit between the two." This conduit was far from poisonous. It transformed the market and, in turn, American society. That is, much to the chagrin of the more nonconformist hipsters who just wanted to be different. The hipster proved that the market responds to consumers' demands and changing interests. They proved that capitalism was not at fault for the ills of the world and could, in fact, be ethical. The idea that this was all lining the pockets of the dominant class is especially laughable because the hipsters decentralized consumption. They fed the starving artists, the local mom and pops, and the creation of new industries. They even helped revive the popularity of the thrift store. Macklemore's 2012 hit song Thrift Shop sounds very cringy today, but it was really emblematic of the times. Hipsters were always looking to find something unique for themselves in an era when everything was being created for everyone. The irony of it all was that hipsters eventually became the mainstream culture itself. But that spirit of individuality and desire to command a space and make a unique mark on the world is very American, really, and its influence has never truly gone away, even when hipsters themselves went out of fashion. One issue I have with the retrospective reporting on the hipsters is this assertion that they were inherently left-wing ideologically. The hipster, to me, is really not a progressive or right-wing. He can be either. You know, the hipster transcends political ideology at times. At heart, the hipster is a sensitive rebel. He's not punk rock or metal or scene. He's not moshing and wearing chains and eyeliner. You know, he's wearing suspenders and a handlebar mustache. But he's dissatisfied to a degree with modern life and strives for authentic connection and interests. In the 2000s and 2010s, this often meant he was progressive and detached and cool. But even Gavin McInnes, who is very right-wing, was seen as a godfather of the hipster movement during his time at Vice. And his sardonic articles about fashion at their core show someone who deeply cared about aesthetics and culture. And I would argue that hipsters from long ago have an inordinate amount of influence today in the new right, with the avant-garde, literary, trad, and crunchy health-conscious factions. All of these movements can trace philosophical and aesthetic foundations back to the hipsters, who can trace their foundations to previous rebel generations and philosophical movements. And most of them were born out of nonconformist attitudes towards mainstream culture, which has become predominantly left. What defines the hipster is the spirit of rebellion and a thirst for authenticity. But their proximity to progressives would become their downfall, because hipsters eventually became synonymous with cultural colonization and gentrification. And this unfortunate association and the blame game that the media played was ultimately part of their downfall. Gentrification is the gradual process in which neighborhoods transform from mostly low-income residential units and limited retail to high-end real estate and businesses with wealthy customers in mind. Think of it as going from dive bars and bodegas to craft cocktail bars and a Whole Foods. The story goes like this. Starving artists move into a working class neighborhood for affordability reasons, and it begins to transform. Maybe you get a mural here or there, someone opens up a coffee shop, then a wave of greedy hipsters attracted to the authenticity and grittiness of the area move in and bring even more business with them. Developers come in, build high rises, raise rents, and the high incomes of these newcomers outcompete the low incomes. Suddenly, the neighborhood looks a lot different. You'll find people blame hipsters and developers for this process, but the secret devil here is zoning. Wealthy neighborhoods really oppose new buildings, which means developers and higher income people must look elsewhere. And often, this means developing in up-and-coming neighborhoods where zoning laws are more favorable. Sometimes, the original residents get priced out altogether. And this is really unfortunate if you're renting, but devastating if you're a homeowner. And the way this happens to homeowners is through property taxes, which are also the devil, because tell me why the government is able to collect what amounts to rent from you for your land that you already own. And they're able to raise it if your neighborhood becomes better, cleaner, and safer. But I digress. We can't blame hipsters for this mess. The solution to gentrification is to liberalize zoning laws and build more housing. And yes, I do mean high rises, because if you want to live in a high demand area like New York City for a relatively decent price, and you're not content with the walls leaking strange brown fluids and having a toilet shower combo, you got to get on board with the high rise. Around 2015, the media was content with characterizing hipsters as these evil colonizers and culture vultures who wanted to displace poor people while stealing their their music, fashion, and apartment buildings. But let's not pretend that the hipster invasion was a totally bad thing. Our cities took a financial beating in the mid-20th century when wealthy people were incentivized to flock to the suburbs through federal housing loan programs. But the repopulation of the city and renewed interest in walkability, beauty, and culture was something that America desperately needed, but one that did turn over a lot of neighborhoods. But let's be honest, nicer buildings, jobs, economic activity, safety, cleanliness, third spaces, and better education opportunities, these are all great things. And frankly, I think hipsters made our cities more enjoyable. But I do understand the negative reactions to a neighborhood in metamorphosis. It's hard to lose the vibes of a place that you have called home, especially if the vibes have become a wash of millennial gray, although I'm not so sure the hipsters would have appreciated that either. And it's especially hard to lose your long-standing place of residence altogether. But again, not the fault of hipsters. The comparisons to colonialism were not only melodramatic, they were caked in resentment and blame shifting. Imagine trying to find a place to live like everyone else, and your mere existence in a neighborhood becomes embroiled in political and racial tensions. It was ridiculous reading the thoughts of millennial writers from the mid-2010s who were desperate to knock these other millennials down a peg. The animosity from the media towards hipsters really came down to the narcissism of small differences. Many of these people shared politics, friend groups, and coffee shops. No one was calling themselves a hipster by this point, but everyone around them was a hipster. And no one labeled themselves a gentrifier as they gentrified their own neighborhoods and complained at parties and in the press about other white people's greed. The true legacy of the hipster is as a defining tastemaker of 21st century America. They revitalized towns and cities across the country, brought in breweries, bicycle lanes, and quaint secondhand shops. They established the much discussed third spaces that had been absent from American life since we fled to the suburbs. They made caring about music, art, and fashion cool again, even if at times they seemed pretentious and rude. Doing things the old-fashioned way is one of the few triumphant rebellions against the digitization of American society. And being a nonconformist is especially important in a world that seeks to control, minimize, and destroy your individuality. I think the hipster way of being never really went away. It just became part of who we all are today. And perhaps we should occasionally emulate the rebellion and aesthetic sensitivities of the hipster and pay homage to the great indie tastemakers of the new millennium. I hope you enjoyed this video. I believe it will be relatively controversial due to the prevailing negative attitudes towards hipsters and their role in gentrification, but that's okay. Let's talk about it in the comments below. My spidey senses are telling me that hipsters will be back in fashion relatively soon, and I'm very excited for that. If you are a hipster, please tell me everything about what that was like. It seemed kind of fun. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications, and let me know what you think of this new setup. I kind of like it. There's no desk blocking our connection. I'm excited to see y'all next week. Ciao.